So I have talked about how I would do a video on how the gender pay gap is a complete myth. And that's what we will be covering today. I explained in a previous video how simply this statistic was arrived at by taking the aggregate earnings of females and dividing it by the aggregate earnings of males. So they basically took what all females are earning, averaged it, and then divided it over what males are earning average. And I kind of touched on how this does not account for many things. It does not account that females are less likely to be STEM majors. It doesn't take into account that women will take leave for pregnancy, which definitely manipulates those values a bit. It does not take into account the fact that women are far less likely to work overtime than men and are far less likely to work dangerous jobs than men. But I will actually be discussing all of these claims with the data today. So that way, in the future, when somebody says, hey, you're not backing up your claims, I can say yes and point to this video and point to the actual statistics that I used. So my first source actually comes from the Freakonomics website. Now, for those of you who have not read Freakonomics, it is one of my favorite books. Now, it's not necessary to understand the argument that is made, but I feel the need to go off on a tangent here, because essentially it explores many things that happened as a result of a certain event, and it happens in the opposite way you thought it would. One example was with a daycare center, where essentially what happened is that I think it was a preschool, they decided to charge parents for picking up their kid late. And more parents would show up late because they felt less guilty when they'd pay the fee and pick up their kid late. They felt that they were paying that fee in order to pick up their kid late. So it had the opposite effect of what that preschool thought it would. So I really did enjoy that book. But let's take a look at the podcast and the transcript of that podcast. So my purpose of using this article is to bring up the issue with you guys, because it has a few notable quotes from a few famous people, such as a quote from Sarah Silverman, who says what she says. She is a writer, comedian, and vagina owner. Women make up almost half of the working population, yet we typically earn just 78 cents for every dollar a man makes in almost every profession. That is not true. The way she phrases it actually makes that statistic untrue, because it is not for each profession. It is an aggregate figure. Political ad: the gender pay gap is real, and women still earn about 77 cents for every dollar a man earns for working the same job. I could keep on saying it's not real, but we're about to get into it. Barack Obama making it during the State of the Union address. And the statement, does that mean women are receiving lower pay for equal work? That's probably the case in certain places, but by and large, it is not that. It's something else. So Claudia Golden is a professor of economics at Harvard. She has been working on gender economics for years and has personally done some of the most influential research. I'm going to read the conversation between Golden and the author. So I define my role by thinking about the issues of today and putting them in historical perspective and understanding what the roots are. Because until you see the more distant past, you really don't know whether you're looking at something that's a little ephemeral, transitory blip, or something that's important. Dubner says, and how important is it for you to get a hold of good data in order to reach those conclusions? And she states, it's sort of essential. I always say that I do not live in a data vacuum. I find it very hard to breathe in a data vacuum. So when explaining where this figure comes from, Golden states, well, it is true that if you took individuals in the labor force and took those who were working full-time, full year, and took all women, took the median annual earnings of those women, and took a look at the same thing for men, and divided the two, it would be 0.77 or around that. Okay? And that's the number that has increased. In the 1970s, it was 0.59, and there is a mantra, 59 cents on a dollar. That's not enough, okay? We are equal to men. We deserve more. So is this for equal work? Is it equal individuals? What economists do is that they try to use data to figure out whether the individuals are the same. They try to make them as comparable as possible. They squeeze out these differences and productive attributes. They took a look for individuals who have the same education, the same labor force participation rates over their life cycle, etc., and they squeeze out those, and we still get a number that's less than 1. So does that mean that women are receiving lower pay for equal work? That's a possibility in certain places, but by and large, it is not that. It is something else. So Anne-Marie Slaughter is a public policy scholar. She states, if you take women who don't have caregiving obligations, they're almost equal with men. It's somewhere in the 95% range. But when women then have children, or again are caring for their own parents or their sick family members who need care, then they need to work differently. They need to work flexibly, and they often go part-time. They often get less good assignments because their bosses think they're not going to want to work. That allows them to travel, or they're not going to be able to stay up all night, whatever it is. And so then you start. If you're working part-time, you don't get the same raises. And if you're working flexibly, your boss very typically thinks that you are not committed to your career, so you don't get promoted. So I think it is important to note that this discrimination isn't due to gender. It's due to the fact that women, or at least many women, have other responsibilities that they want to take on, and that is absolutely okay. But it's important to realize this is by personal choice, not discrimination. So the rhetoric of 78 cents on the dollar or whatever it is simply does not apply, because it's not due to discrimination. It is due to personal choice. Golden then goes on to acknowledge that women often take jobs that have different characteristics and different amenities. By amenities, Golden means not getting a free lunch or so on and so forth, but she means what Miss Slaughter said. She means that job flexibility. So I like this example that Golden gives. I like to think about an individual who gets a degree, let's say a law degree, and it's a woman. And now I have an individual, a man, who gets a law degree, and they graduate from law school, and they're both equally brilliant, and they both get their jobs in approximately the same kind of firm. By and large, they're going to earn approximately the same amount when they start. Things will continue in their lives. They'll both perhaps find partners, get married, have kids. It's often the case that the woman will leave the very large law firms that put a lot of time demands on them and go to smaller firms or become corporate counsel, become part-time corporate counsel perhaps for a while. They will go to small firms where the workload is somewhat different. So then Golden goes on to discuss something called occupational segregation, and I'm not going to read this article verbatim because it would take a while, but essentially it's that certain occupations, higher paying ones, are dominated by men, and certain lower paying ones are dominated by women. And this isn't due to discrimination, it's due to personal choice. So Golden mentions her previous concept of working the hours that your firm wants you to work. And she says, so in fact, something like 3/4 of the difference, if you look at 469 occupations in the census, and you look at how much is due to the fact that women are disproportionately, and she means working flexible hours in certain occupations, and how much is due to the fact that within each occupation there are differences, 75% is due within each occupation. Thus, another way of putting this, you could hypothetically give women the male distribution of occupations, and you would wipe out only about 1/4 of the difference in earnings between men and women. So, just to reiterate, it seems like the part of the gap that is due to occupation only accounts for about 25% of it. The vast majority of it is due to the kinds of flexibility that many women want in their job. So I'm going to step away from the Freakonomics article here. It's a great article to read. It summarizes everything well, and I'll put it in this description, but I don't want to solely use that article because it is essentially an appeal to authority, and I don't want to be accused of it. I actually want to show you the data if you want to refute this. Now, if you're perfectly happy with the explanations I have given, you can end the video right here, but I would advise against it. So I'm going to go into specific sources of what they state. The first thing is let's talk about the 77 cents on the dollar figure. So this first article is from AmericanProgress.org. Once again, I'll have the link in the description. The most commonly cited statistic for the gender wage gap asserts that women only make 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. However, a great deal of contention surrounds statistics measuring and quantifying the gender wage gap, and the confusion is not entirely without merit. Some of the controversy around the wage gap estimates and its figures is at least partly due to the fact, like many statistics, the exact figure changes slightly depending on the data source used. With competing statistics and a highly politicized issue, the very existence of the gender wage gap is often called into question, along with its significance and driving causes. The 77 cents formulation is a colloquialism, shorthand for expressing a complex economic truth. Simply put, what conveys it is the fact that if you average out what all women working full-time year-round earned and compare to a number of men working full-time year-round, you'll find that women take home 77% of what men do. Now, we have already discussed this and why it is invalid. So I just felt the need to take another source that explains what this figure comes from. It is not from taking all men all women with the same job and all men with the same job and dividing it. It is not that. It is an aggregate figure. This article then asks whether is it accurate. Well, it is an accurate statistic for the aggregate figures divided by each other, but it is not accurate for saying that women make 77 cents of what men make. It only makes sense in the broad sense, but it does not make sense on a per job statistic. So let's go on. Like all statistics, a 77 cent statistic tells a particular story. It's calculated by dividing the median earnings of full-time year-round working women by the median earnings of full-time year-round men, all rounded to the nearest hundred. I think they mean $1, not $100. Now, essentially, by median, and this is an important statistical concept, they're taking out all of the outliers. It's instead of taking the average, you're taking the middle point in the data. So there are many things to explain this gap: occupational differences, differences in hours, and we've already discussed this earlier, and family caregiving, also discussed previously. So Of course, this article, for whatever reason, does a full 180 and essentially states that, well, that only accounts for 41.1% of this discrimination, and that 60% of it is influenced by structural and social factors. Once again, I highly doubt this. Working the hours that your company wants is a huge factor. I don't think that this discrimination comes from cultural bias. I think that these economists are neglecting to take into account something very important, and that is the fact that if you work flexible hours, your boss will not take you seriously. This article also doesn't mention many things like overtime. It does not mention overtime, maternity leave. Actually, it did in taking care of your families, but it more of made it seem like working less time to take care of your families, but not the long amount of maternity leave that is taken during and after a pregnancy. So one of the major factors that I mentioned was overtime. And first we need to discover what does it mean to be overworked, which is essentially when a man puts in a certain amount of hours into overtime. So the article starts off discussing self-segregation, but then it mentions the concept of what it is to be overworked, and the paper's authors defined it to be putting in more than 50 hours a week. And a lot of workers, especially in high-earning professions, are overworked than they used to. Those workers are making more money than everyone else, not just because they work more, but because they make more per hour. Lo and behold, it seems that we are living in a meritocracy. Surprise, surprise. You make the amount of money that you earn. The work that you put in is what you get out. So it ended up being found that 15% of men worked 50 hours or more per week, compared to just 3% of women. This is not just an indicator that men are making more in a given year, but on average they're making more hourly, because this phenomena of working 50 hours or more per week tends to mean you're making more hourly, as well, as explained previously in the article. Once again, I'll link the article in the description so that you guys can read it. This next article it's pretty liberal, but I'm just using it for the statistic that they give, and that is 43% of women who leave the job industry after having children, nearly half. So far, when we're looking at this, it seems like we can attribute two things to correct this 77 cents on the dollar figure somewhat. We have the fact that men are much more likely to work overtime and much more likely to be overworked. And then we have the other factor of working flexible hours. And the problem there is that women can work the same amount of hours, but since they're not working the hours that the company wants them to work, they are making less. So we could come to a more accurate or a more reasonable conclusion by taking these two things into account. So this entire article is actually pretty interesting, but I'll only be covering a part of it because we don't need all of the data. It kind of goes through all of the history of the gender wage gap and then other factors that we really don't need to take into account. The first thing that it has a diagram that is of particular interest to us, and that is that on average, if you take the average salary, the gender pay gap becomes 84 cents on the dollar. And for women of ages 25 to 34, it is currently at 93%. Now, it seems, just looking at that society is on the right track. It is on the way to becoming closer and closer. Women are getting closer and closer to their male counterparts in terms of what they're earning. But the reason why they're earning what they're earning isn't because discrimination is being solved. It's because they're working more traditional hours. They're working less flexible jobs, and they're putting in more overtime. So once again, it's currently at 84%, and essentially it is $14.90 as opposed to $17.79. Now, once again, this does not take into account flexible hours. It does not take in. It just makes up for the fact that women work less hours. It does not take into account everything else. Now, what I have here is essentially a breakdown of the kinds of majors that men and women have. Now, if you look at what women have, they have healthcare fields, education, social sciences, other applied fields. I imagine that means, here it is, includes architecture, communications, public administration, and human services, design, and applied arts. I'll extend it down here so you guys can see the whole thing. Humanities. Let's see. It seems like with biological and physical sciences, there is no significant difference. Business, it seems pretty fair. But look at computer and information systems. And look at STEM majors. Some of the most highest paying jobs are in STEM. So it seems like a large part of this disparity, it can actually be put on the jobs that women choose, and that isn't sexist. That's their own choice. So essentially what I have here is a comprehensive list of how many people major in what, and it has it broken down into male and female and the year. So let's take a look at this. Now, I'm going to focus on the 2012 year, which is the right-hand column. When we look at the amount of female engineers, we have 489 majors issued, and I forget how where this comes out of, like what it's looking at. I can't remember whether it's nationwide or not. But remember that 489 in engineering. We scroll down to men, and it is 3,049, and it looks like it's by associates. Now, granted, not all, simply put, what you majored in isn't guaranteed of what kind of job you will get, but it is a pretty good indicator. And when there are 489 associates of engineering issued to women and 3,000 issued to men, it does explain the gender pay gap pretty well. Let's take a look at some other things. We have non-science and engineering down here. It seems like that is science and engineering, but it does account for a lot of the disparity in wage. So we can go on to look at the 10 lowest paid majors. So we can go on to look at the highest paid jobs in America. You have physician, pharmacy manager, and software architect. Below that, you guys, I'll extend it so you can see it. You have software development manager. Let's take a look at who these jobs are dominated by. As you can see, it is dominated by men by almost a 2-to-1 ratio of males to females. So pharmacists are the only job that is on this list where there are more women in the field than men, and it's only by 52%. Another article from Forbes states that approximately only 10 to 12% of software developers and engineers in LA are female. In addition to this, only 17% of job placements were women for all technology positions. This just goes to show that the majority of this gender pay gap is not due to sexism. So when feminists say, oh, it's because of the patriarchy, which, by the way, is the most improperly defined term ever used by feminists, or at least one of them. I'll get to that in another video, but it's simply a false claim. Now, we could also look at the top 10 lowest paid majors. Behavioral science, which I already showed through that sheet of majors, it had it on there that the majority of people majoring in communications and psychology were women. We have general education, which I actually don't know the breakdown of. Simply put, let's scroll all the way down here. Child development and psychology, women, social work, women, animal science, I am not sure about. Now, I'm sorry for simply stating the majority of these are dominated by women. You can look them up yourselves. This video is running really long right now. Let's take a look at animal science, just out of intellectual curiosity. So I did some more digging, and I actually found this table from, essentially it was in the sources for another video, and this is essentially precisely what I've been looking for. It has the highest paid majors: petroleum engineering, 87% male, pharmacy, 48% male, mathematics and computer science, 67%, aerospace engineering. Look at all of these majors. The only one that isn't dominated by men is pharmacy. Now note that the top 10 least earning majors are all dominated by women. Psychology, childhood education, I suppose the only one isn't theology and religious vocations, human services and community organization, social work, drama, and theater. All of these, except one of them, are dominated by women. So another important thing that I mentioned was the most dangerous jobs, and the most dangerous jobs are occupied by men. Simply put, men are, it's roughly 10 times more likely to have a fatal injury. So I just wanted to be thorough. I just wanted to mention it. I think it's important because I made that claim that I had to put evidence in there. I almost skipped over it, which is why this is kind of out of place in the video. So what does this look like if we do this based off of job rather than taking an aggregate sum? So I think this last diagram sums it up pretty well. When we look at it based off of a per job basis, the difference is marginal. And this difference can actually be explained for two reasons. One is the job flexibility, which I mentioned earlier. But the second is actually due to something else. Women are less likely to ask for more money. They will not ask for a raise. And this can attribute to the rest of that 4% difference. So rather than believing everything these social justice warriors and feminists say, it's important to take a good hard look at the facts. And the facts don't lead towards the SJW's assumption that this is caused due to institutional racism. It leads to that this pay gap is due to personal choice. It is due to flexible hours. It is because of the difference in job occupations. It is because they major in different things. People can get a job in whatever they want. It's not due to sexism. So I hope you all now can refute the gender pay gap, especially after the time and effort I put into this video compiling all this stuff. Honestly, took quite a while, and that was with not just me looking for my own sources, but also using sources that other people put in their own videos and sources that were put together through online papers. I never, by the way, you'll notice that I never used a video as a source, so I tend not to put those videos. I read a lot of papers that essentially compiled a whole bunch of different other research papers, and rather than using the one paper, I found all the individual papers. It's similar to, essentially, it would be like the Freakonomics article that I used at the beginning of the video. I didn't want to use that because it would be an appeal to authority. Those Freakonomics discussions, they had a lot of sources. They had a lot of information that was valid, but I actually wanted to find actual sources. And this whole thing, it really angers me. It really makes me frustrated because I still see this figure being thrown around blindly, even though it's been refuted. Gosh, I mean, I've known about this data for about 2 years. I remember, for those of you who don't know, I went to Boulder, Colorado for a year. I ended up transferring because it was so liberal. But at CU Boulder, I remember talking to this feminist, and she was talking about the gender pay gap. And I, as a conservative, I mentioned the hard facts, and she actually didn't get upset, which surprised me. She said, I remember the conversation. She said something along the lines of, anybody who refutes these facts is in denial about society. And I said, actually, they're not. And these facts are something that I've had down for quite a while now, because I've had so many discussions about this. So I hope you have all gotten something out of it, because I remember when I learned about this, it was definitely something that I thought was important, because that 77 cent per dollar figure, it's one of those things where you hear it and you say, yeah, I can believe it, but it turns out to be completely untrue. Even looking at the hourly wage, it's 84%, and that is the aggregate hourly wage. And if you look at it in young adults, it's 93%. And you got to realize this is compiled with all jobs. So even though women are more likely to choose communication majors, psychology majors, education majors, and general education majors, the difference between an education major is you want to become a teacher. General education is a major in nothing. They still are making 93% of what a male makes, and men are more likely to become doctors, engineers, scientists, so on and so forth. Also, I find it ironic. There's sort of this leftist indoctrination in schools, which I'm sure I'll cover in another video. And essentially what it is that these women, or just people in general, they take these majors and they take these classes and they'll learn that they'll earn less because of their race or gender. And as a result, they'll say, you know what, I need a major in gender studies, and they'll make less due to their major. I mean, here I am. I'm working hard for a computer engineering degree. I have a background in math and physics. It's not easy. I have to work hard. But what I will make in the future isn't due to my gender. It's due to the effort that I put in. It's due to all of the hard work that I'm doing right now to learn all of these advanced things. So that concludes this video. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did making it. This was a very difficult video to make. It took it took a while. It took a lot of effort. So I hope you guys got something out of it.